All right, let's jump into the presentation. All right, so the biggest question is, what is insulin resistance? A lot of people are not even familiar with what this term actually means, so I'm going to dive in from a pretty surface level perspective as we talk about this. But what we're looking at here is that the cells that are usually responding to insulin, which insulin is then delivering energy to the cell in order for metabolic purposes to occur. But at some point, your cells start to become resistant to insulin. And now the insulin is looking for a place to store the excess energy, and it will typically store it in other places. And this is typically things like your liver, your pancreas, or even around your waist. But let's go back to insulin resistance and looking at the time frame here. So looking back at 1983 just to 2008, the number of people in the world with diabetes increased sevenfold from 35 to 240 million. And in just 3 years following 2008, we added another 110 million diabetics, bringing our total to 350 million. And so since then, in the last 11 years, we've actually brought ourselves up to around 463 million people worldwide are living with diabetes. And the researchers at UAB actually found that 40% of young Americans are actually experiencing insulin resistance, and as a result, some increased cardiovascular risk factors. So why is this happening? That is the big question. Well, we're first going to look at poor sleep. So for any of you who don't know, or maybe aren't prioritizing your sleep like I never used to when I was in my 20s, I used to try to train myself to thrive or function at least off of just 4 hours of sleep going through grad school. Obviously, that was not a great idea, and it led to a lot of my own health problems. But greater than that, when we start seeing short-term sleep deprivation, just less than 6 hours of sleep on an average time period, we actually will start to see, and again, just in a one-night instance, we can see an increase in your cortisol levels. And whenever you have cortisol increasing, you're going to start seeing an increase in your blood sugar demands. And as a result, you'll start seeing an increase in your food cravings because your body is wanting more sugar to carry out functions of survival. But let's look at food. So food is, and I put quotation marks around food because food's an interesting conversation, because a lot of us are eating foods and we don't really know why we eat foods. Like we look at veggies, we look at fruits, we're like, yeah, we know they're good for us, but we don't really know exactly what they do. And so good foods, foods that are made naturally, foods that are coming from the earth, foods that our bodies are used to, are going to give us life. They're going to give us phytonutrients. They're going to give us properties. They're going to give us things that our bodies inherently need that we don't often really appreciate. And so these nutrients are being fed to us to allow our bodies to function at a level that is necessary just for survival, but more than just survival. It's allowing us to thrive and to function at a high level. But foods over here, they're going to be giving us a lot of toxins, and they're going to be taking away nutrients. So a lot of these foods will provide what are called as anti-nutrients, where they actually will take away like minerals and key vitamins from our bodies. And so they're not only not giving us nutrients, but they're also taking away nutrients. And so this is a big, big problem. But I wanted to give you an example because a lot of people are so caught up on calories. We're so focused on reducing our carbs. We're so focused on cutting our calories. But I want to use this example from 100 years ago, looking at this indigenous tribe in Native America, or these Native American tribes. They were thin, fit, and healthy. Their diet mostly consisted of whole grains, squash, fish, melons, chia seeds, legumes, lentils, and peas, beans, hot and mild chilies, herbs. But the interesting thing was that the food was unrefined and unprocessed, obviously. It's 100 years ago. But the other interesting thing is that it was high in carbohydrates. And so, a lot of people are getting so bent out of shape about carbs, but it's really not so much about carbs and calories as much as it is about the quality of food that we're eating. But the other interesting point here is that they had years with lean or scarce foods. And so they had to rely on survival instincts and using fasting as a bit of a way of survival. So now we're looking at 100 years later, modern times. This same culture is now the second most obese population in the world. 80% of their adults are over the age of 30 are experiencing diabetes. And the average life expectancy is only 46 years old. Their diet is very typical. It's Western fast food and processed. it's broken, it's refined, it's not necessarily even real. It's still very high in carbs, but also very high in glycemic load and refined, and it maintains a lot of chemical ingredients, which I'll be referring to in here just a second. And these kind of carbs are being rapidly converted into sugars. And so this is a big problem when you're talking about insulin resistance and making this problem worse. This is what we start seeing happening. So again, I always tell my clients to, instead of counting calories, count chemicals. Learn to count chemicals instead of calories, because calories, as I just alluded to, are not always the problem as much as they are when you're dealing with refined calories that are not serving your body well and that are converting into glycogen very quickly, leading to an abundance in your cells. And then your cells then saying to your body or to your insulin, hey, I don't need any more. And you start creating this resistant relationship. So what exactly are the chemicals, right? Like what exactly should we be avoiding? And most of us have seen probably some of these on a label. Maybe we even heard about them in the news. But I want to just tell you that, these kind of things are a big problem in our society, and they're leading to a lot of toxin overload. And then because we're lacking nutrients in our diet, now we are having an inability to actually detoxify. But it's also important to learn to identify sensitivities. So our sensitivities are what's going to be leading to an increase in inflammation. And so as I was relating to earlier with cortisol, we are starting to see that cortisol can be influenced in a wide variety of different ways, but inflammation is one of those ways. And whenever our body's experiencing inflammation, we start having difficulties with gut health. We start having issues with the ability to absorb nutrients. And so we have to learn to identify our specific sensitivities that are specific to us as the individual. And so I provided some examples here, and this is not complete, but I want to provide some examples just to kind of get your mind spinning a little bit. And oftentimes people are thinking like, well, dairy is good. I need my calcium. It's an animal source. I know it's good for me. We've been drinking it for years, blah, 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 blah. But I'm here to tell you that dairy can be a major issue when it comes to causing a lot of inflammation in your digestive tract, and also leading to a lot of lymphatic stagnation. And so the lymph system is actually the detoxification system. It kind of cleanses out a lot of the bio waste or digestive waste of our bodies. And so oftentimes we'll start seeing this in people's skin. You can start feeling it. Your skin feels kind of tight. And this is usually an indication that your lymphatic system is probably overrun with metabolites and creating a lot of this stagnation. Gluten and dairy specifically, they can cross-react and create a big reaction between the two of them. And they can create a big inflammatory response that actually can target the enteric nervous system, leading to a lot of things like anxiety and depression and brain fog because of what that connection is between the gut and the brain. And obviously grains, just because, you can have gluten-free things doesn't mean that it's going to be healthy for you. Oftentimes, a lot of other grains, like even things like rice, can be high glycemic index, number one, but also they can be, because of the shell in a rice grain, can be very pro-inflammatory to your gut health. Processed meats, again, like meats by themselves, if they're good quality, fish and even some red meats can be very good. But if they're processed, if they're grain-fed, like things like that, they can be very harmful to the digestive tract. Refined oils, again, those can be very, very troublesome in what they do to your cellular health and making your cell very rigid and not allowing it to have much flexibility, which again is very, very harmful when it comes to accelerating the aging process and leading to more dysfunction, specifically again with insulin resistance. Legumes, nightshades, eggs, like again, these are a whole big list you have to kind of consider. But the reason I put down at the bottom here, I put pickles ? And peaches ? I've once had a couple different clients that they actually had issues with these two different things. And so part of what I run my clients through in my program is we have a process of identifying what these, how you can identify what your specific issues are, but sometimes it's not always what you think. So now we are hitting chronic stress. So let's get into stress. I've already kind of alluded to this a little bit already, but stress has two different forms. There's acute stress where it's more short term, and then you also have chronic stress. And so it's not always just that stress is a bad thing. There's also a whole category of eustress. It's EU stress, and basically what that means is that this could be a good beneficial stressor. You think of things like intermittent fasting, or you think of things like exercise, or you think of going under like a really difficult situation, but you're doing it for a short period of time. Your body is actually really adaptive, and it really can be very beneficial for you. And an example of this is just, in the situation where your body is under attack and you're running from a bear, you're in a fight or flight situation where you're trying to survive for your life, your body's actually going to release a bunch of platelets, or this thing called fibrinogen, which is actually going to lead to more platelets, which will lead to more clotting that will occur. So that if your body does get in a situation where it's cut, it's not going to have a bunch of very fine blood. It's going to clot the blood very fast so that you don't actually bleed out and have a hemorrhage or die or something of that nature. So it can be life-saving in that sense. It also has a lot of benefits for your brain in the short term. It can also promote better immune system health as well for a short period of time. But the problem is when we start seeing this chronic stress, we start seeing high blood glucose or high blood sugar. We also start seeing a dysfunctional immune system where it's starting to become dysregulated. We also start to see, because of that whole scenario where I mentioned with your fibrinogen and your blood clots, it can start to lead to things like heart attacks and strokes. So this is where we want to ensure that we are making the stress event in a short-term lived event and not experiencing it on a chronic basis. Okay, so what about eating window? All right, so I provide this example, and I want to make sure I provide complete clarity here. This is very important for people to realize because our bodies have different hormones that are being secreted, and hormones are messenger molecules. So just like cortisol, we have other hormones such as melatonin, and melatonin kind of has the opposite effect on our bodies that cortisol has. And so whenever you're eating past 6 o'clock at night, our body is going to experience an increase in melatonin around 6 o'clock at night for most people. So if you're a nighttime worker, you can kind of do the same calculation. So if your typical bedtime is 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and that's fairly consistent, and you're controlling the light and things of that nature, your body should start to secrete more melatonin that 3 to 4 hour period right before you normally go to sleep. And so what's going to happen is that melatonin is actually going to decrease insulin sensitivity. So again, we want insulin to be very sensitive. We don't want to reduce sensitivity to insulin. We want to make it very sensitive so that your body knows what to do with it when it's encountering high levels of insulin. But as people go on, they're eating past 6 o'clock at night, their body is going to be more likely to store this food that they're bringing into their body as glycogen. And glycogen is just basically the broken down form that's going to be utilized for energy. So you're not going to be storing that as glycogen and not be stored as triglycerides or as fat. And you're more likely to see this on your lab panels, which we'll be talking about here at the end. So what about the opposite? So 6 a.m., you're going to be having, if you're waking up at 6 a.m., 7 a.m., your body's going to be having high levels of cortisol, typically for most people. And so your cortisol is going to be increasing, and this is going to be more elevated throughout the midday. And cortisol is going to make insulin more likely to be sensitive. But again, if this is acute, that's going to be beneficial. If it's a normal pattern for you throughout the day where you're waking up, you have high cortisol, you're controlling your stress, you have healthy adrenal glands, and this is not like you're experiencing high levels of stress across the board, your cortisol is actually going to serve you pretty well. So this may sound a little bit contradictory compared to what I just said in the beginning, but the fact is that, again, if this is a short-term effect, it's a very healthy and beneficial effect. So typically what I tell my clients in my program is eat about 80% of your calories before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And this is, again, if you have a regular daytime shift. If you're a nighttime worker or you have weird windows, you just have to kind of think about what is your lunchtime and figure out what that time looks like for you. But we're just basing this on the fact that our bodies are going to know, they're going to have a better ability to adjust to what our hormones are doing. So our hormones are going to have more of an influence on how we store energy or how we utilize energy depending on the time of the day. All right, so nutrient deficiencies is what we'll be talking about now. So in a general population, we'll typically see about 70% of the population is deficient in magnesium. And magnesium, again, and the primary reason for this is that magnesium is often coming from the soil, right? And so our soil is where we're getting most of this through different plants and things of that nature. But because of our farming processes and because of the soil erosion and things of that nature, we're starting to see a major deficiency in the population with magnesium. And magnesium, if you haven't read, I have a whole handout on this on my private Facebook group and also in my program. But basically, magnesium is so critical. It's involved in over 300 different processes in the body. It's such a critical factor that our bodies absolutely need magnesium. But specifically when you're dealing with insulin resistance, oftentimes what you'll start to see is in the mitochondria. And so the mitochondria are these things that are making the energy, right? They're the quote unquote, the powerhouse of the cell, but they do so much more than that. But one of the big factors that they're involved in is the ability to make energy and utilize energy. So whenever we're ingesting things, again, we're ingesting our food, it's going in our stomach, it's being absorbed in our small intestine. We're starting to see that is now going to be trying to get into the cell to have a cellular effect. And on the cell level, we're looking at the mitochondria. And so the mitochondria are going to be converting these things and making ATP, which is our energy. So if we don't have sufficient levels of magnesium, we start seeing major difficulties with the ability to utilize fats as an energy source. And so magnesium is a very critical mineral to be having in our diet. But more than that, 42% of the population is deficient. And so there's this, again, I provided a whole list of these on my Facebook group and different pages that I posted on. But basically, deficiency is considered is a very, very low number. It's less than 30. I think it's PNG per milliliter or something like that. But basically, if you're less than 30, you're considered deficient. But in a functional medicine optimal perspective of having optimal health, if you're below like 50, you're suboptimal and you're not going to be thriving or functioning at a very high level. So the conventional range is about 30 to 65 or 70 probably. And then the functional medicine lens reference range that we're looking at from a lab perspective is about 55 to 65 in that range. So you can obviously see a big discrepancy that makes a huge difference. But specifically with vitamin D, it can have a huge impact on your ability for insulin to be very sensitive, and which again is a good thing. So again, we start here with magnesium. We have a deficiency, and this will often lead to a vitamin D deficiency. And then a vitamin D deficiency, again, in combination with magnesium deficiency, will often lead to obviously more insulin resistance or less insulin sensitivity, which is a bad thing, and it creates this very vicious cycle. So let's talk about some supplements and some deficiencies. So CoQ10 is required in every cell of our body for the mitochondria to produce energy. And most muscle cells have more mitochondria than any others in the body. But the heart is most arguably the most important muscle in the body and needs to be strengthened for people with diabetics or even insulin resistance. But the crazy thing that you start to see is that, again, because the majority of the population is starting to see elevated cortisol levels, elevated triglyceride levels because of this insulin resistance, you start seeing more and more provider or physicians actually prescribing statin drugs. And statin drugs have been known to kind of decrease CoQ10, which then creates more of this issue with more decreased energy production, which then people then start relying more on carbohydrates as an energy source, and then they start getting more insulin resistance, and then they need more of the drugs, and it creates this very vicious cycle. So CoQ10 is a very important one to consider. You can't really see this because my little recording screen here is in the way, but L-carnitine is an amino acid that actually helps to shuttle fat into the mitochondria to be burned as an energy source. And so again, if your body doesn't utilize fats very well as an energy source and you try doing things like intermittent fasting, you're going to really struggle because your body is used to consuming carbohydrates. And as soon as you start transitioning into consuming fats, it's going to be a struggle, a difficult struggle. Okay. All right. So then secondly, we got magnesium. So magnesium, as I mentioned before, I already talked about that at length. So you guys can just kind of read through that. And then vitamin D, same thing. You can start to see how vitamin D deficiencies can have a major impact on insulin sensitivity and leading to more of a likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes and even type 1 diabetes, actually. As far as supplements go, berberine can be a very good supplement option for a lot of people. Alpha lipoic acid is another good option, and I kind of provide some options down there as far as dosage. Resistant starch, things like Miracle Noodle can actually help with excessive hunger and provide prebiotic support to your gut health. And then obviously omega-3s. Omega-3s can be very helpful. So what I'll do is I'll provide a link for my protocols that I like to help people address these deficiencies. And so you can kind of look at the different levels there of what you may need as far as supplementation. All right, so the last one is activity. So let's talk about activity. So being sedentary is an independent risk factor for type 2 diabetes. So that alone can drastically increase your risk for type 2 diabetes and obviously insulin resistance. Skeletal muscle is the primary source of glucose utilization. So like where we actually utilize much of the sugar coming in. And so the larger muscle mass you have in your legs, the more fuel you'll need to burn, and the less likely you'll have insulin resistance. But be cautious, because making it feel like you have to go to the gym to do this is not what we want to do. Because this, again, if your body is not ready for this and your body has not been preparing for this, going to the gym and immediately killing yourself is not going to be helpful. So we want to make sure that we're gradually building yourself up, and walking 30 minutes a day, doing some like gradual sit to stands from a recliner, just doing things that are nice and easy to kind of promote more lower leg muscle mass. And here are just some examples, of how to like improve your activity level without having to actually go to the gym. But, doing simple floor exercises, walking the dog, walking up and down the stairs, walking with your groceries, those kind of things. So I wanted to briefly talk about lab markers for you to identify whether or not you may have insulin resistance yourself. So this is just some couple panels that I wanted to demonstrate from some past clients that we kind of showed that they had decent cholesterol levels. They were showing good levels of like HDL and things of that nature, even had good triglyceride levels. But then you look at their glucose, fasting glucose, you look at your A1C, and you start seeing that they're actually having they're showing signs of insulin resistance. And so the first indicators of insulin resistance typically is if your triglycerides are over 100, if your fasting blood glucose is over 90, and I put variable because there's several different reasons as to why that could be higher short term. And then if your A1C, which is basically like looking at your blood sugar over the course of 3 months, like looking at a photo album, this is like looking at like a snapshot, your fasting blood glucose of like in the moment. And then your A1C is looking at like this, a period of like 3 different months and looking at how your blood sugar is stabilizing. So if you're over like 5.5, 5.4, somewhere in that region, you're starting to show thick black smoke. And it's like, most doctors are not calling the fire department when they're seeing thick black smoke. They're like, we won't call it a fire department until we're seeing your blood sugar at like 6.2, 6.3, 6.4 when you actually have diabetes, which at that point, it's a much more difficult road to kind of start reversing that, but it's still definitely very possible. So again, if you look under my full script account, you'll see insulin resistance protocols. Again, these are just some markers to look at to see like what your potential level of insulin resistance could be. You might start seeing, these numbers, like I mentioned before, at the intermittent stage of insulin resistance, you might start seeing like might feel like low blood sugar, kind of like lightheaded. You're worsening of your lab markers, things getting worse. And then at advanced stages, you don't want to guess at this point. You want to make sure that you're actually seeing your doctor, that you're discussing with your PCP, that you're actually, if you're currently on medications that are lowering your blood sugar, then you definitely want to be working with them to get off those. And obviously in my program, we help you do this safely, but that's the priority you want to be focused on there. So, all right, I think we're going to take a little pause here, just to make sure everything's going well. And we'll just check back in just a second.